So I appreciate the board president clarifying the purpose of this meeting and that we are not in the process of discussing whether there are any privileges to be waived, because that is a closed session discussion. However, if the board does want to entertain the notion of waiving these privileges, then that is a discussion we should have.
Well, now I'll get to that one in a little bit later, but I'm going to go back to a couple questions because we're in a specific mode here. I'm just asking in general. We do have board policy 1340 around access to district records, which I'll get back to later. There is board policy around access to public records, which I think we're going to need to be looking at. But also, this is a very specific request from the Contra Costa Times, Mr. Borenstein. And part of the concern in this particular Public Records Act request, which is different, the process you described is, and I asked you the general process, but the process you described is generally these items, these requests come in and your office deals with them. So I'm going to ask you the question that Mr. Rolen, given that your contract was one of the 5 in question, why didn't you recuse yourself from any participation in this entire process, including Mr. Borenstein's Public Records Act request? That is one of the big questions here that brings the board into this tonight, is normally those requests come into your office and you respond to those requests. The reason we're sitting here tonight is because of your relationship in this particular subject, which are those 5 district administrator contracts, one of which is yours. So my question is, why did you respond to this Public Records Act request?
It's my obligation as attorney for the board to respond to this request. This request is not really any different than any other Public Records Act request that comes in. Any request for documents made to the district is essentially made directly to the board. So as counsel for the board, I responded to the request. It doesn't mean that I had any involvement or implication or poor dealings with regard to the subject matter of the request. There's been no finding that that anything having to do with the contracts has been inappropriate, nor has there been any finding that there's really a conflict of interest. What we have been doing is engaging in the trying to avoid the appearance of impropriety with regard to these contracts, and all I did was assert privileges on behalf of the board, which is my obligation. I have to do that. I imagine we could have spent a lot of additional money to have each lawyer that was involved in this process do a separate Public Records Act response. However, that's not required.
So you see no concern that you responded on behalf of the questions around these 5 district administrator contracts in terms of collecting and reviewing those documents and deeming which ones you thought were confidential?
I see absolutely no problem with me as counsel to the board responding to a Public Records Act request.
And I'm suggesting on this particular topic, I'd like to ask Dr. Lawrence, how did you participate in this Public Records Act request? Because it was also directed to you as well.
The same way I respond to all of them, we send them to Mr. Rolen, and Mr. Rolen sends out the emails to the appropriate people. In this case, he emailed all the council members and board members, I believe, and asked for any emails that you had received or sent, and I got that email and went through the process of looking through my emails and then giving him copies of anything that I had sent and received. So that was my part of the process. But I didn't review anybody else's emails or any other documents. So I don't even know what else was turned in to Mr. Rolen.
And that's another follow-up question, which is that one of the things we've been criticized for in this Public Records Act process is what I call a reluctance to provide information, reluctance to respond rapidly. So what I'm suggesting is, for example, as a board member, this request came in on January 21st, is my understanding from Mr. Borenstein's letter. On January 30th, 9 days after the request came in, I got an email from you asking me to send documents because you needed to respond by February 1st, asking me to send any documents to you. Well, that was 9 days into the request. So my concern is, why did you not contact board members early on within a day or two of getting that Public Records Act request to seek those documents. I understand that within 10 days, you simply need to respond. It's not that you have to produce all the documents within 10 days. But I see that as a slow response, a reluctance to respond. And I'm asking why it took 9 days for me to get notified that there was this Public Records Act request, and then I had a day or so to produce any documents relevant to this topic.
You answered the question. The 10-day period is for response. We complied with that 10-day period. It's unusual that board members would be in possession of documents related to a Public Records Act request, and I sent the email out to staff immediately, and I sent the email out to board members subsequently, but we did not compromise our response in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I'm wondering how you can formulate a response that we have confidential documents when those documents are submitted 1 day ahead of your response, or actually less than 24 hours ahead of your response, that we have confidential documents. Because that's part of your response to Mr. Borenstein, and part of why we're here is this question around what those confidential documents are. So to me, you had less than a day to prepare that piece of the response, because I presume I got notified along with the rest of the board members on the same day, on January 30th. And we had a day to put together whatever it is. I sent you some things. I had very little because, frankly, I had little to no communication about all of these contracts along the way. So I sent you a few things, and I imagine others sent you a few things. None of what I sent you was very limited, very minor number of things. None of them was confidential, and none of them was provided. In the end, it was simply one document, one letter that you released from an attorney, and then the rest of it was kind of a reference to some of these things were always public. So what I'd like to know is, given that I sent you some things that were pretty benign, non-confidential, those were not provided. And I'm wondering why you sorted, it appears to me you sorted through what was to be released. And why did you not make available all documents, given that all of mine were non-confidential and none of them were released? So I presume there were other non-confidential items that were not made available. So I'm wondering how you made this decision not to just release everything and let the person who's filing the Public Records Act request be the one determining whether or not these are relevant documents.
What you're suggesting is allowing somebody who's requesting documents to determine whether that's the right documents to receive. That's not the way it works.
No, I'm asking you, when they're non-confidential, why are you screening through them?
If we are getting to a discussion about what documents are confidential and what documents aren't, that has to be held in closed session.
Actually, no, because I'm going to ask you an open session, which is, what documents does the district have? This is not a breach of confidentiality, and I will challenge you on this right to the end. It is not a breach of confidentiality. Part of the concern here, and the reason we're sitting tonight with an extra meeting, is what confidential documents or records does the district have that are responsive to Mr. Borenstein's request?
The Public Records Act requires that we respond and tell the type of documents we have, but it doesn't require we do a list of documents.
Exactly, but in confidential documents you need to have some specificity. So are we talking about 3 documents, 1 document, 12 documents, 18 emails, 14 letters? What is it we're talking about when it says confidential documents?
The
Because
documents.
Mrs. Denler asked earlier as well, what is there? Well, we're sitting here as a board tonight, and I have to say, we're sitting here as a board tonight probably saying, what the heck is there? And so when the response goes out and it says confidential documents, that's all it says. And we're here tonight. Had we gone into closed session, we may have gone into closed session looking at documents that were not even confidential and thus been in violation of the Brown Act. So my question is, what confidential documents or records does the district have that are responsive to the request of Mr. Borenstein?
Again, I would assert that if we are going to be talking about specific documents, that it has to be held in closed session. All non-privileged documents responsive to Mr. Borenstein's request were provided to him.
Okay, again, when we talk about confidential documents,